Welcome, everyone. To those of you just tuning in to our panel today is called Binge Watching Hate, Strategies for Fighting the Rise of Digital Extremism. A big thank you to our co-sponsors today, Define American in partnership with Counterpoints Arts as part of their Pop Change Salon series. And we're going to start off introducing you to our panelists. I'm going to let each panelist introduce themselves because we need to get right to it. They are fascinating people with fascinating work. I will start us off as I'm the moderator. I'm Sarah Lowe. I'm the Director of Research and Impact at Define American, immigration rights nonprofit, using the power of story to change the world. I started my career in children's book publishing, transitioned to interactive producer for Disney. The heart of what my work has always been is looking at how stories can move people to action. And I had a little plot twist in my own career in that I ended up being a health equities researcher. My PhD is in community health education with a focus on critical narrative intervention. And what that is literally the science of how stories can change the world, and also community resilience. So the science of how storytellers support each other in remaining strong in the face of adversity. That's me. I'm going to be your moderator today, and I'm going to turn it over to Tony to introduce himself.
Thank you for having me. My name is Tony McAleer. I spent 15 years in the white supremacist movement as a skinhead, neo-Nazi, as a leader and a Holocaust denier. I left that movement in 1998, and with the help of a wonderful mentor that I met in 2005, probably went through about 1,000 hours of one-on-one and group counseling to understand and unpack how I got there in the first place. That led me to co-found in 2010 Life After Hate, an organization dedicated to helping people leave the violent far right. And I spent 10 years there working on helping others who are where I once was. And then the last sort of ongoing chapter of my story is going back to the communities that I had harmed in atonement and reconciliation, and modeling what that looks like for other people to go beyond just leaving, but to make amends.
Thank you. Zahed, could you tell us a little bit about your work?
Sure. My name is Zahed Amanullah. I'm a senior fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in London. I've worked with ISD for the better part of 15 years, looking at community engagement, specifically with regards to Muslim communities, and became more involved around 2014 in looking at early research in counter narratives. And this is around the time when groups like ISIS were using internet technology to recruit people from the West to join their cause. And the research that we did over many years looked at the power of narratives in general, at first counter narratives, and working with people like Tony as well on that for against white supremacy, but also against Islamist extremism. And then looking at the power of narratives amongst youth to build narratives about their concerns, narratives around vulnerable communities, and then looking at those issues around elections, specifically when disinformation rears its head quite prominently, and then going on through the 2020 elections and now through COVID-19, and even now during the war in Ukraine, where disinformation impacts communities and how narratives can help combat that, and building capacity for organizations to fight that.
That's a perfect segue into Francesca. Could you tell us about your work?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me here today. My name is Francesca Tripodi. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Information and Library Science and a senior researcher at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at UNC Chapel Hill. And for the last decade, my research has looked at socio-technical vulnerabilities that would have otherwise remained invisible. So I use ethnographic methods to see how society uses platforms in ways that are unintended by programmers. It started with some work on a now defunct, although kind of keeps popping up again, site called Yik Yak, and how community users used content moderation to actually silence minority opinions. I also look at gender inequality on Wikipedia and how deletions are part of a more insidious way of devaluing women's work in society. And then I look at how search engines are manipulated for political gain and the way that search engine optimization is used to spread propaganda.
And finally, over to my colleague, Shauna.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shauna Sigulco. I'm the Director of Digital Storytelling at Define American. And just to give a little context for DA, as we call it, we're a narrative change organization. So we really believe that in order for policy to change around immigration, first, we need to shift the national conversation. So our interventions are to advocate for better representation of immigrants in the media. And my background is a little bit different. I come from production. I started in television production in 2012. I worked on food and travel TV. Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown was my first show. And then I moved over to Nickelodeon. And in 2015, I worked on a show for MTV called White People, which was an hour-long special starring Jose Antonio Vargas, where we explored young white Americans' views on race throughout the country. It was Emmy nominated, and that's where I met the founder of Define American, Jose. I moved over to the LA Times after that and did video journalism. And then I joined Define American properly about 6 years ago. So my background really is in production and documentary filmmaking. But in my work at Define American, it has shifted over to digital research.
Yeah, and so first up, Shauna, I wanted to ask you about how Define American chose to make this shift. So you and I started talking about 3 years ago about some research that we felt was crucial to our work, and that has led to a whole new pillar of work at Define American. And could you tell us a little bit about what you were seeing in the landscape and understood from your own background, what we needed to address, and a little bit about your work these past 3 years?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, I'm a filmmaker. So my work at Define American originally was around creating original content. So we had access to these really wonderful stories and communities, especially within the undocumented community. And we felt, as part of our theory of change, that what we really needed to do is uplift those stories. So we would go into these communities and create documentaries and then disseminate them online. The distribution side of this was where we hit a challenge. So it didn't matter if we had a really great distribution partner with a bigger brand, or if it was just being published on our own channel. What we started noticing is that our stories weren't really penetrating the progressive filter bubble online. And we realized that what was really essential for our work was a better understanding of what the digital landscape around immigration looked like. So this was really back in 2018. And around that time, we also started paying attention to some really great research and scholarship that was coming out at that time. The Norman Lear Center published a study called Are You What You Watch? That looked at how television viewing patterns compared to political beliefs. And we realized that in this country, we're really not all watching the same media. So if we wanted to shift people's viewpoints on immigration, perhaps we needed to be looking at a different media ecosystem. Around that time, there was also a really fantastic study by researcher Becca Lewis with Data and Society around the alternative influencer network on YouTube that explored far-right content creators on the platform and how they were able to kind of disseminate their extreme views on YouTube. So we decided that YouTube was an important space for us to look at and do research on. And that was how the research report that we just published came about. It's called Immigration Will Destroy Us and Other Talking Points. Sarah and Francesca both worked on that report as well. And essentially we were asking three major questions with that report. The first was, how important is YouTube in shaping hearts and minds around immigration? We found out very important. What does the anti-immigration network look like? And is packaging important? And I'm sure we'll get into the details of all of those questions, but essentially what we found when we put together all the different pieces of the study is a better understanding of the landscape for why anti-immigration narratives have been so effective and powerful on the YouTube platform.
Yes, and full disclosure, everyone on this panel are here because Shauna and I were just huge fans. So the past 3 years when we've been doing our research, there were folks that stood out that their work really changed and shaped the way we were thinking about this research and about the practical uses of it. Just to start us off, we were big fangirls of Francesca's and reading everything out there that Francesca had written. And particularly what drew us to Francesca's work is, Francesca, you're a sociologist and a media scholar, but your work transcends academia. It is very practical, very useful, speaks to us in lay terms where we as practitioners in this space could figure out how to read your research and figure out how to use it to fight back against these narratives that we were seeing. And you have a book coming out on August 16th, The Propagandist Playbook, which, we've got a preview of and we love and have highlighted and made notes already. You can pre-order it now where books are sold. So I wanted to ask you, Francesca, what are some crucial findings in the work that we did together, but also your body of work at large, that practitioners in the field need to know to create counter narratives and understand what counter narratives might work and what might fall flat? Just tell us broadly what you're seeing that could be useful.
Thank you for that introduction. And it makes me happy to know that people outside of academia read and engage in my work. That is something that's really important to me. So yeah, my book is coming out in August, and it looks at the 7 techniques that political elites and media personalities use to spread disinformation. I don't want to get into all the 7 strategies specifically, but some of the key things that I think are really important to take away from the book is one, that people have different ways of engaging with the media. And so one of the central things that I talk a lot about is that we kind of think of media literacy as this one size fits all idea, but depending on how you were raised and what your worldviews are, the way people engage with sacred texts or media content is very specific, and understanding those nuances are extremely important. If your goal is to create counter narratives, you have to make sure that you are engaging with your audience in a way that they understand, and also engaging with your audience in a way that resonates with the values that they identify with. The other huge thing that I talk a lot about in my research is the role keywords play when searching for information. And so a lot of us go on to Google and we think of it as this window into the wider world. But more often than not, it's reflecting a lot of our biases back to us. This idea I first got, shout out to Safiya Noble's work, Algorithms of Oppression, but she talks explicitly about how when Trayvon Martin, before there was the massive shooting in the the Charleston church, Dylan Roof had gone onto Google looking for information about Trayvon Martin. And in doing so, searched Black on white crime, which doesn't exist and actually is a very specific phrase cultivated by white supremacists. And so unsurprisingly, the top return was the Council for Concerned Citizens, which is a very extremist group. And using that website, he became more engaged with this logic and this rhetoric. And so I've been thinking more clearly about how our starting points really shape our endpoints. And we think a lot about these like algorithmic filter bubbles that the companies keep us in. And those are definitely there, and we have to be mindful of them. But also my goal in my research is to try to put a little bit more onus on us and how we start our search and why those starting points are so important. And then the third thing I think a lot about in my book is how people manipulate those starting points, right? So there's a really sophisticated way of seeding the internet with problematic content and then signaling those concepts and those ideas. And we see these in our report, right? So one of the big things within the Great Replacement Network are these same ideas and keywords, chain migration, right? Shauna, you'll have to help me. I'm trying to think of another really important one that we saw again. The role of the gumbo network or demography. Demography is a big one, right? Population replacement. And ultimately these keywords are tied to like very historical white supremacist ideas that aren't new. But by making new phrases, propagandists can really take advantage of new platforms like YouTube, Twitter, and then they reinforce these messages on other networks like the radio and other platforms. So that's the kind of the three takeaways from my book. And I would say the extremely unsurprising / non-surprising was how interconnected a lot of these networks are, and that a lot of the far-right white supremacist ideas that we think of as very extreme have been watered down so that they are part of a lot of the information ecosystems that we would classify as not necessarily far-right. And that propagandists use these ideas to make them seem logical and palatable and acceptable. And that is something I think of really grave concern that we identified in our report as well. So it's been really fun working with you.
Yeah, I know that the keywords in our work was mind-blowing to me. We come from the immigrant rights sort of movement and that sort of lens. And the keywords that we thought might be showing up, the anti-immigrant keywords, when we actually did our analysis were very, very different. It really showed that filter bubble that even when we are trying to put in our conscious of imagination of what those words might be, we were really off. I remember Western civilization being one that came up on the list that would have never entered our imagination, that Western civilization was a keyword that was playing into the metadata around anti-immigrant content online. And for Shauna and I, in our journey with this research, once we started understanding the big players in this great replacement network that we were finding, you will not replace us, right? That's the mantra at the center of this like great replacement theory and narrative, conspiracy theory. We started to get scared. Because we realized the giants that we were taking on. We realized that these are not folks who play fair, and we are social justice folks at heart, and so we value playing fair, and we got nervous. And one of the people that we turned to for guidance was Zahed, and there are conversations that we've had along this journey that Shauna and I keep dipping back into like a well. And our first conversation with Zahed was one of those. We wrote copious notes and we still reference them all the time. Zahed is so brave in your work and so nuanced and still empathetic and courageous. And when we came to you with our trepidation about taking on anti-immigration organizations, you gave us some really amazing wisdom, both practically and tactically, and from this is how you can step into this work and protect yourselves. And I just wanted to give folks the chance to listen to your insights on this particular question of when you're looking at taking on some of these giants that don't play fair. How do we protect ourselves as advocates doing this work?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I'm really flattered by your description of our conversations, and I all I can say is that this has been a long journey for me, and following people like yourselves and Tony, and I'm really heartened to hear Francesca's work too, because it just chimes in with so much of the research that we've done over the years. I mean, the good news is there are things we can do, and there is evidence in our daily lives of the power of narrative succeeding, even though people will tell you it's difficult to measure, it's difficult to assemble the parts. Storytelling is a very sort of, it sounds simple, but it actually is the result of a lot of complex, the impact from narrative and storytelling is a result of a lot of complex attributes that have to be carefully assembled together in order for it to work. And that's, but it is doable. And I think, we're seeing now, for example, in Ukraine with President Zelensky, like his chief role is to craft the narrative of what the struggle of Ukraine is all about. He says not micromanaging things on the front lines. He understands that the power of narrative will be a game changer for them. We're seeing that sort of as an example, but over the last 10, 15 years, we've been fighting these battles in smaller ways. What I would say is that, I'll give 3 examples, for that lessons that have come forward for me in the work that I've done. One is credibility. And Tony can speak to this. Like I said, we did some work with Tony in 2016 on crafting counter narratives. Our first work was in 2014 when we looked at crafting counter narratives to ISIS messaging, and we used the talents of an animator of a Muslim background who was a former extremist who created videos that were countering specific ISIS messaging, and we used YouTube and we partnered with Google for that, and it was a keyword-based approach. On the one hand, it really worked where one of the videos literally facilitated a 5,000 word rebuttal from ISIS because they were so in a way threatened by the counter messaging. On the other hand, I was being fed the ads because I was researching Syria, even though the ads were meant to be targeted for people looking to go to Syria to join that fight. And so you can see that while it did work in some cases, in some other cases it didn't. And with the work with Tony that we did in 2016, that was geared toward white supremacists in the US. And I remember the keywords that we chose at the time were far more time specific and trend specific, and far more in line with the words and the codes that people were using, in real time. They weren't commonly used phrases that would be caught up, for example, in news reports and other things. They were really meant to catch the people who were using words and phrases that only people within white supremacist movements were using. And I recall at the time, Tony, correct me if I'm wrong, that we had some responses from people who actually who saw the videos and were asking to see if they could get help in leaving extremist movements. So that's an example of how it can be really powerful and impactful, but it's also a resource intensive process. So the second thing I'd like to mention about that is, how do we build capacity to actually produce this stuff at scale so that the impact can reach far and wide? We attempted this in another context in Kenya in the 2017 presidential elections there, where we tried to create a mass sort of educational movement around 50 non-governmental organizations in Kenya who were interested in things like violence against women, tribalism, extremism, electoral violence, things like that. But they felt helpless because the messaging was sort of being controlled by political parties, and actually, in that case, Cambridge Analytica was joining that struggle. So we tried a very careful way of making sure that these groups could produce messaging around the elections that would minimize the impact of those issues on the election process. And we had a lot of anecdotal evidence that it was successful in that we tested the impact of videos that were created. We made sure that the videos that were created weren't overproduced. They were culturally specific. They were created by people who were known in communities. That credibility was really, really key. And again, we got a lot more data points about how, the breadth of that narrative creation could positively impact a usually fraught, circumstance, like as presidential elections often are. And the last bit I would say is, authenticity. And again, this is the function of a lot of different different things. The one thing I would mention, I think maybe one of the things that we've spoken about, Shauna and Sarah, is that counter narratives often have a very short shelf life. They're often responses to very specific instances that require specific responses, and they're very context specific. There were early attempts to sort of reuse counter narratives in different contexts, and they would utterly fail because, on the one hand, these narratives are created below the radar. They're meant to be authentic, and they're meant to be viewed quickly without people, interpreting that there is a mass sort of effort to change people's opinions. It's important that people understand that these are actually authentic views held by authentic people that reach people at the right time. So this requires a lot of constant re-innovation. It's an iterative process. Every time we create narratives that are then, and we have the tools, of course, technological tools to measure this stuff now. Every time we release something like this, we can measure the impact. We can understand what parts of that impact are related to our efforts, what parts are related to environmental, and trends and things like that. Take the right lessons and apply them to future efforts, and make sure we're not repeating any mistakes that we may have made. And by the way, we made plenty of mistakes over over 10 years. There was a lot of times when things just absolutely failed. We would go to young groups of young people and say, hey, create a counter narrative against ISIS, and they'd be scratching their heads. They'd say, what do I have to do with that? I mean, these are early lessons that you learn very quickly, that you can't just sort of have a script and hand it to someone and say, you do this. So over time, we realized that the key to that is these have to be authentic stories driven by the passions and the interests and the desires of people, especially people in vulnerable groups who have their own stories to tell that are just, because they're not related to security interests, they're not being told. So those are the quick lessons that I would just put forth on that.
Yeah, and even as I'm listening to you, thinking about creating messaging, creating stories that are culturally relevant and authentic, and coming from the people that are trying to reach the same people, right? Because we are not fools. We know when people are trying to sway us. We know when people are with us, when people are against us. And it really is, if you're going to cut through all of that BS, right? It has to be culturally relevant. It has to be in the language of the folks you're trying to reach. It has to sort of emotionally resonate and be in the tone. And you have to understand and have a lot of empathy, I think, for the people that you're trying to reach. And, nobody does this better than Tony, right? I mean, when I listen to Tony speak, Tony, you carry both sides. Like, you have been so deep into both sides that you have this amazing way of bringing us to a space where we can cut out all that noise, see each other as people, and start to understand what we need to move forward. Both your work and Zahed's work for me is like, you think, it feels like this big, heavy work. It feels like we are facing giants. And yet when I listen to you, I see the hope, I see the strength, I see the way in. A quote of yours, Tony, is literally what we've used to name this panel, because it has just so blown us away. You've said before, in this day and age, you can literally binge watch an ideology in a weekend. And when we are looking at that kind of like download of ideas, that's both scary and inspiring, because that can go both directions, right? And my question for you is, you've walked both sides. What have you learned about bringing us back to common ground? Where is that walk of hope, where we start to see and understand each other as human beings who can see things differently?
That's a great question. And I think it's really important for everyone to remember that while we talk so much about the impact and the whole online space, the technological space and influencing people, we can't lose sight of the fact that the first social networks are human, interacted without technology. And as human beings, we have the incredible power to influence and inspire those around us, those that we come into contact with, for better or for worse. And I think that we need to start looking at ourselves first, and look at our behaviors, who we are in every moment of every day, and how we treat other people, because how we treat other people infects our social networks in a human sense. And I think, I believe that if we just practice three things, if everybody practiced three things, the world would be a different place. And those three things are curiosity. We're curious about people. We're curious about why they believe what they believe or how they got there. Compassion, when we can see the humanity in other people, despite how they're presenting to us. And those two things require courage. And so we practice curiosity, compassion, and courage, the world would be a very different place. And it's very powerful how those things, when you practice them, you go out and try and perform an act of kindness to someone who you feel doesn't deserve it for whatever reason. And I saw this video the other day where you don't even have to sort of be involved. It was homeless people, I believe it was in India. And somebody came up behind them and just dropped off a bag of necessities as they were sitting on the street, and then walked away. And these people, found this bag. They went from despair into elation, praying. Our ability to transmit this kindness to people, it's so infectious, and not only does it make that person feel good, it makes us feel good. It's very, very powerful. And so it's a message. I'm very hopeful. Not that we have the answer in our hand, but we have the potential for the answer, for peace. It is within our grasp if we practice it.
Oh, I'm going to be sitting with that for a couple of weeks. I think that that resonates so deeply that you have to truly extend an act of kindness to others who you wouldn't connect to, that you don't believe in, that it starts with kindness, the kindness of heart, to have the curiosity rather than the walls, and the courage and the compassion to walk that walk. There's something we've been circling around today, which is, how do you take that? How do you take the curiosity, courage, and compassion and infuse it into mass media, as Zahed was talking about, into these authentic stories and speaking the language, and then combat this ugly network that is fundamentally attacking compassion and saying, no, we're logical. And Francesca, I wanted to bring this around to you, because for the rest of the panel, we're going to have just basically a group discussion, because we all have a lot that we want to talk to each other about and learn. And Francesca, I know that you're dying to dig in on this piece, so feel free.
So, well, two things that I would love to just touch a little bit more on. One, I think we have, I've noticed like two kind of patterns. One, how do we build an effective counter narrative, right? I think that's one of the questions that all the panelists are talking about. And I think I would also like to just draw again on our research for this report, as well as my book, to say that metadata. Like, if we want our narrative to spread, we have to understand how the internet works and how people look for information. And so a part of my book is I did a comparison of progressive and conservative YouTubers, and I looked at how they tag their content. And I found that overwhelmingly, people who are spreading progressive narratives tag their content accordingly, like use tags that are within their narrative, but that those who are spreading like their own set of counter narratives, we have to recognize that sometimes the counter narrative is against what we believe too, right? So people who are spreading these counter narratives are really sophisticated at tagging their content with keywords that actually don't embody their message as much as attack the message, right? So, if you looked at, for example, the phrase social justice as a tag was very rarely used in progressive channels and overwhelmingly used in these conservative networks, where the messaging was actually that social justice warriors are over emotional and not fact-based and illogical because they're run by these feelings over facts. So one, I would say, if we want our narratives to spread or counter narratives to spread, we need to be really mindful about how we tag those narratives and how we reach those audiences. And then the second thing I think is important for us to consider is, like, I totally recognize and appreciate this idea of coming to people that we want to believe our ideas at with compassion. I think empathy, as an ethnographer, empathy is essential. But we also know from the report that we all released, that movable middle, for whatever reason, right? That emotive frame that the pro-immigration groups use, right? So the top most engaging videos are the ones that are like, we're daughters, we're moms, we're active parts of the community, like, have empathy for us. Those don't resonate. They don't get nearly as much engagement as the ones that we saw that are like, immigrants will destroy us. And so I think an important question is, like, one, how do we create engaging counter narratives in a way that resonate, while also maintaining that desire for, like, compassion, which I do agree is extremely important.
Yeah, I'm gonna tag on to that too and say, when we started doing this work, and even it's a weekly, like, struggle for us is, how do you find the balance in your messaging of staying true to your beliefs and budging on your language? That's been sort of a difficult road to walk, and very careful and nuanced in the way that Zahed is talking about, of like, it's a slow process, because we're balancing so much stuff there, our own morals, our own language, somebody else's morals, somebody else's language and framework. And Zahed and Tony, I wonder how you tackle this in your work and what you've encountered in that way.
Okay, well, I'll just start really quickly on that. I mean, that's really, really important point. I think one of the things that we learned early on is when we launched a youth network to try to sort of further experiment on counter narratives, and we found that the inertia for a lot of people was to create narratives that were, for lack of a better word, preaching to the choir. And while they were, create a lot of excitement with people who already agreed with the same viewpoints, they didn't move the needle with what Francesca's referring to as that movable middle, the people that we need to join the struggle in order to really drive away the sort of extreme voices. And as Tony will also emphasize, a lot of the work that we've done in countering extremism requires a lot of attention on grievance and the way that extremists exploit grievances to create their narratives. So there's a bit of a vacuum there where the one thing that people who do want to make a change weren't always effectively addressing was that grievance that was sort of sitting there that nobody really wanted to touch, except the people who wanted to exploit people by co-opting those grievances. Takes a bit of a struggle to sort of get around the concept of tackling that, because it doesn't automatically come natural to a lot of people to sort of want to address those difficult questions. They want to talk about the hope, which is great. It's always good to sort of reinforce, the empathy and the compassion that people who already believe what you believe feel, but without successfully occupying the space where grievance exists before it gets co-opted. If we don't do that, then we're not going to really make the impact that we want to make.
And I would add to that sort of slightly different tack. I believe that the level to which we dehumanize other human beings, for whatever reason, whether it be the color of the skin or the baseball cap that they wear, is a reflection of our own internal disconnection and dehumanization. And that's where the compassion piece comes in. The people that are involved in the far right, and I learned this lesson through my own experience in counseling and the work I did at Life After Hate. People would say to me, what do I say to my uncle, my brother, my my friend who's really into this stuff? And I asked him this question. I said, do you want to be right, or do you want to affect change? And he goes, what do you mean? And I said, if you want to be right, tell them all the reasons why immigration is great, and have this sort of battle of minds and ideas. But that's not really where the problem lies. The problem lies in the heart, right? And when I was in that movement, white supremacy just wasn't what I believed. It was who I was. It was my identity. It was what I read, what I watched, what music I listened to, the friends I had. If there was a breakfast cereal, that would have been what I had for breakfast every morning. And the challenge is, and for a lot of people, identity and ideology become intertwined. And when identity and ideology are intertwined, when you attack somebody's ideology, you're attacking their identity. And then all the ego defense mechanisms come up. They lash out, they shut down, they do whatever. So the answer isn't always necessarily to go in through the head. And what we learned at Life After Hate, the ego has no defense to going in through the heart. And that's why compassion is so powerful when we took people, and after Charlottesville, we had all kinds of, you name it. We had gay people, Black people, Jewish people, trans people, everybody you can think of that, from a marginalized group contacted us and said, hey, if you think that, a white supremacist would benefit in meeting me as a person that they hate, I volunteered to do that. And there was an extensive list. And what we learned is when people have these human experiences, and the example I'm going to give is a person who was an Iraqi vet, maybe in Afghanistan, seen his friends blown up overseas and hated Muslims. And he was starting to have ideas about going and doing harm at the local Muslim center. And he called us and we said, well, can you hold on? We'll be there within 24 hours. And it really was on the border of duty to report to law enforcement. So two of our guys went there, met with them, and they contacted the imam from the local Muslim center and said, look, do you have any time to meet this guy tomorrow? He said, I'm really busy, but I can spare 15 minutes. So they spent, the day with this guy, and the next day they took him to see the imam at this Muslim center, and 15 minutes turned into 2 hours and tears and hugs. And this guy who had wanted to do harm to this Muslim center found connection there, and the relationship between the imam and that man, and he's been connected to that Muslim center, continues to this day, and it's extraordinarily powerful. All of a sudden, there was no discussion of the benefits and the beautiful features of Islam at all. It bypassed all of that, and it was through the heart. And I've seen some studies that, for example, in counter narratives that don't deal with I wouldn't say even it's counter narratives, but Moonshot, an organization, did some things where they targeted white supremacists and they put mental health ads in their feed, and those involved in the extreme far right were 3 times more likely than the average person to respond to those ads. So while it's important to talk about narratives and counter narratives, we need to talk about where change really happens, and it's not in the head; it's in the heart.
Oh, I had not heard of that work. That is blowing my mind. All of it, especially thinking about mental health ads and the way you can direct messaging in different ways that gets more at the root. That's what, when I listen to you, Tony, it's like you just get so down to the root of what it means to be human and how we connect as people. So I'm thinking, and now my mind is thinking about those ads, and I need to go look up. You said Moonshot. Yes, Moonshot does those ads. I need to go learn everything everything I can about that. I know this is something that we were particularly interested in our own research is there is the language of the other side and our side, if we're in that side's mentality. But there's also a visual language, right? So somebody can be watching TV with the sound off, and if I walk past that television, I'm going to know if that's a show that I like or if I don't like particularly, especially if it's like news or something, right? There's an aesthetic, especially to our news these days, that speaks to that polarization. And something that we were looking at with our research is once we get the language right and the message right, we still have to get that visual language right, or it's still not going to it's still going to fall flat. Back to what Zahed was saying about the being culturally relevant and authentic. And so we were looking at a variety of different tactics, visual tactics to speaking that language. And Shauna, I wanted to start with you by kicking us off and talking a little bit about like the kind of tactics that we were looking at, and specifically what you see coming to this work as a producer, as someone whose medium is to create videos, and also just open it up broadly to what are we seeing that works in terms of the types of narrators, the types of colors, even the way that you show your charts, right, is important. Shauna, can you tell us a little bit more about our research on that and just spin it off for a bigger discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. And before we move into the testing we did with Swayable, I really wanted to go back to what Tony was saying about identity versus ideology. I'm pretty sure I've quoted you a million times. I don't know when you said it. I think you were on a podcast, but it's not about ideology, it's about identity. And I think that foundational thought really gave us a direction for our research. We wanted to understand what is the identity of what aesthetic elements are communicating identity in the content that we saw in the research that we did. Francesca developed an incredible methodology to really figure out what are the top performing anti-immigration pieces of content on YouTube over the last 15 years. So we looked at that content and we analyzed the different styles and the different content creators. We really saw that the majority of the content was coming from either the Tantan network or this channel called PragerU. So pretty interesting that two well-funded institutions are churning out this content. It's not coming from individuals. It's coming from companies. But what we saw there was that the majority of the content looked like explainer videos or educational. We even saw some patterns in the types of animation that they used. And going beyond the aesthetic, though, we also saw that a lot of what the content was communicating was fear. So I think a lot about, what Francesca's saying about, they often, anti-immigration content creators often frame their arguments as if they are, we're the logical ones, we're the ones who are courageous enough to talk about the truth. The other side are just hyper emotional and cowardly. And what they're really doing there is fear mongering. And I think they're really playing into the grievance culture we were talking about earlier. What Tony's been talking about, it sounds like to me, is a culture of healing. And I'm wondering how we can balance the authenticity of healing and working with content creators who speak to the audiences that we're trying to reach, with the challenges of filter bubbles and metadata. And also makes me think back to our report and how we started with a list of keywords that we thought would definitely show up in the metadata of the anti-immigration content creators. And what we found out is that we really don't know what we don't know. We don't know beyond our own perspectives, right? Either as filmmakers or as advocates. And I think that that's where data can really be helpful in showing us a way forward and a compass towards how do we speak to the identities that we're seeing online, and how do we have an authentic connection with communities that are, different from ourselves. So it's a very interesting to me to hear the different perspectives around how do we have those authentic conversations, and how do we also address the challenges of the digital age that we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I was thinking about this, exactly what you were talking about, Shauna, about to Tony's point of identity and ideology that are so intertwined, and reaching out, trying to use our media to reach out in different ways, and speak to people in ways that they understand, and also understand, to Francesca, what Francesca is talking about. So Francesca was talking about the metadata, right? So, for those who might not know, metadata are keywords that accompany content online. It's what the search engines are looking for to pull your content up and out to you. And that was such a powerful idea to me, right? That we are looking at the language that's embedded in our videos and talking directly to an audience, but that metadata is also the language of the algorithms, the language of how things get pulled up in front of us. And so there's this sub language. Somebody had said, I think it was Zahed said, are created below the radar, that many of these other narratives are created below the radar. And this metadata is also a piece that's below the radar, right? So like all of these layered pieces of which come together to create the media that we see. And what I find really exciting and hopeful about work like what all of us are doing is like no organization or individual has to carry that work, that we all work together on our pieces. And as long as we have forums like this that bring us together for thought and understanding and inspiration, then we collectively understand what we need to do, what others are doing in pushing the needle forward and bringing us back to that place of humanization, where we can just have conversations with each other. We are drawing near at the end of our panel, but I just wanted to let each panelist talk, if you want to, just say what do you see that you feel like is bringing us back together, that brings that hope, literally to the name of Tony's organization, Life After Hate. Like, what brings us to common ground? What's inspiring you in this moment? And anybody can jump in here.
Well, if I could, I run an organization called the Concordia Forum, which is a global network of leaders of Muslim backgrounds, includes storytellers, business people, filmmakers, and also, interestingly enough, stand-up comedians of Muslim backgrounds. And they're always coming to me and telling me, guys, I'm doing so much heavy lifting for us when we're trying to craft narratives. I go into hostile environments and I make them laugh. And from that point on, they're always, and I laugh at ourselves too. And he's like, they're like, they change so much in a very short period of time, and they create shareable content and all of that. So what gives me hope about that is that there's so many places that we haven't considered where narratives can be created and enhanced and amplified and shared. We really need to think outside the box. It can come from every sector of society if we involve every sector of society in that framework of crafting a narrative that builds resilience in our society. I mean, that the potential is everywhere, as Tony was referring to before.
I can chime in next. I would say what gives me hope for the future is the work. This might be a bit of a cop-out, but the work of the people on this call, the work that's happening in the narrative change space and the mis and disinformation space. I think that in the last couple of years, there have been tremendous strides made to better understand how digital narratives are impacting society, and creating resources and tools to counteract some of the more negative forces out there. So I think, looking forward, a lot more collaboration, a lot more resources in this space can give us a lot of hope.
I'm always the optimist. I'm always very hopeful, and I think it's important to to remember that, when we talk about curiosity, courage, and compassion, it's not necessarily outside of us. The first place that curiosity, courage, and compassion has to start with ourselves. And when we can have compassion for ourselves, the more I was able to, as part of my healing, the more I was able to connect with myself, the more I was able to connect with other human beings, the more I could connect to my humanity, the more I could see the humanity in other people. And we all have people that we despise or dehumanize, and so we have to examine ourselves there. And as human beings, we're coming from a place of fear or love. And as human beings, we get to choose which one if we stop and think about it. And it's important to choose love. And when we choose love, we inspire the people around us. And it's important to infect everyone that we can with this wonderful virus of love.
I'll just say, I think what gives me hope is seeing more white people involved in this advocacy work. So I think it's really important to recognize that grievances are being exploited, but I think it's also easier for those of us who are not the target of those grievances to have courage and compassion. And so as a straight, I'm a straight woman, I'm a white woman, I'm Christian born, I was born in the United States. And I still have a hard time seeing some of those videos because they are hateful. But I think it's really gives me hope to see more people like me who aren't the target of those grievances take on that work and take on that role in conjunction with everybody else already doing the amazing work. I'm not saying I think we've kind of co-opted that as like, oh, well, someone else is sort of taking care of that. And I think it's really important for white Americans to recognize the role of whiteness and pay more attention to that. So I'm hopeful for that.
To Zahed's point, I saw a bumper sticker the other day that was completely against my ideology, was really poking at like my own ideologies, but it was super funny and it made me laugh. And I thought, I could have a conversation with that guy. And that gives me hope too. And I'm a sucker for good story, right? You make me laugh. Okay, that's a good starting point. What brings me hope and inspiration is the work like all of you are doing on this panel, and all of your colleagues. It brings me tremendous hope and light in this dark patch in which we work. And so I just want to thank each and every one of you for doing the work that you do, and your organizations for doing the work that you do, and for being courageous, curious, and compassionate in your work. Thank you for bringing your insights today. A big thanks to Counterpoints Arts and Define American for hosting us today. This video will live on Facebook. So if you enjoyed today's panel or want to go back and find pieces to listen to again, as I will, feel free to go back and listen again, and please share. And thanks all for being here today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.